Welcome back. We're ending on the wildest stuff. Spy tradecraft, fear training, and the weird politics of identity. And then it gets even bigger, because it turns into power, equality, and why people secretly want an edge. Right? It starts with surveillance and somehow ends at world order. That is such a CIA sentence, honestly. The surveillance detection route part was the first thing that got me. Not vibes, not gut feeling, an actual process over hours. I love that even espionage has paperwork energy. Like, hold on, let me do 6 hours of paranoia professionally. But that's the point, right? The discipline is what makes the paranoia useful. And that already tells you something about the kind of mind they recruit. He basically said anxiety is an asset, which is such a mind bend. Most people spend their whole lives trying to get rid of anxiety. He's saying the CIA wants people who are already alert and slightly uneasy. That's almost offensive to calm people in a funny way. Calm people caught astray there hard. But I do buy the idea that a little anxiety makes you less lazy. You notice more, you question more, you don't coast. What I liked is he didn't romanticize it. He called it training plus temperament. That stress inoculation idea is actually practical for normal people too. Like, don't wait to become fearless, just practice being uncomfortable in small doses. Ask your friend if your shirt looks bad before you ask the universe to heal you. Baby steps, but make them humiliating. Exactly. Small embarrassments as therapy. The interesting twist was when he basically said fear helps the economy because people stay stuck. That was cold, but also kind of honest. He's not pretending everyone gets liberated. He's saying systems depend on compliance. That's a brutal way to describe modern life, but it's not crazy. He draws this line between the people who act and the people who keep consuming. And he's basically saying the gap between them is where opportunity lives. Which is a very unfriendly way to say, get moving. Yeah, there was no comfort blanket in that answer. The disguise section was also fascinating because it ruined the movie version completely. Not glamorous, not magical, just making sure you don't look like yourself. That is such a depressing definition of espionage. Mission impossible, but with bad glue and sweaty foreheads. And he kept bringing it back to operational reality, like heat, cold, sweat, adhesive. That part matters because it strips away the fantasy and replaces it with craft. I also found the sex espionage part weirdly useful, which sounds insane to say out loud. Yeah, that sentence is never going to sound normal. But his point was about power shifts, attachment, and why intimacy can compromise control. So it's not just scandal, it's operational risk. Romance, but make it a security problem. That's actually the most terrifying version of romance. What I kept noticing was how often he reduced everything to incentive and leverage. Even relationships, even national power, even identity. He really does think in systems, not in feelings. Which is why the family section hit harder than I expected. Leaving the CIA wasn't just a career move, it was a parenting move. That's the part that makes him feel more human. He and his wife both resigned because the job had swallowed their home life. And that's very different from the macho spy story people want to hear. People want smoke and mirrors, and he gave childcare logistics. That's actually the real sacrifice, though. The geopolitics section was where he went full chessboard mode. He thinks the world is already in World War III, just not in the old form. That line lands harder because he means proxy conflict, not tanks everywhere. Ukraine, Taiwan, all of it as pressure between larger blocs. And his point about parity between the US and China was actually pretty sharp. Two superpowers sounds stable until you remember both will be staring at each other. He's basically saying the world gets more fragile when no one is clearly dominant. Great, love that for us. Yeah, nothing says peace like two giants sizing each other up. But the most controversial thing he said was about equality. He basically argued people don't actually want equality, they want advantage. That is such a brutal thing to say on a public podcast. But he didn't mean everybody is evil, he meant the desire for edge is universal. And that creates this gap between public values and private behavior. Which is uncomfortable because he's not totally wrong. Humans love ideals right up until there's a ranking. Then suddenly the ideals get very flexible. What do you do with that, though, if you're listening as a normal person? I think the answer is not to become cynical, but to become honest. Like, admit that you want more, but don't lie about why. And maybe that's where the identity conversation matters most. He said, you are often the worst judge of who you are. which is humbling because everyone thinks they know themselves extremely well. But other people see the public version, not the magnified private panic. So maybe identity is less a truth and more a story you keep editing. That's probably why action matters so much in his framework. You don't think your way out of fear, you move your way out of it. And you don't discover yourself by sitting perfectly still. Which is annoying because stillness is so much easier. I liked that he made change sound unromantic and repetitive. Just do the small scary thing, then the next one, then the next one. Very unglamorous, very effective. And that might be the whole takeaway from the episode and the whole series. Not magic, not inspiration, just repeated uncomfortable action. Which is kind of brutal, but also kind of freeing. That's a good place to end the series, honestly. We started with tradecraft and ended with the human condition, as usual. That is the most podcast thing ever. If people take one thing from these 4 episodes, let it be this. Act before you feel ready. And maybe stop waiting for your identity to become perfect first. Because that day is not coming. We'll leave it there, and we'll see you in the next one. Welcome back. We're closing out on the weirdest mix of spycraft and self-help imaginable. This one is about fear, disguise, and why knowing people is basically the real job. And somehow it ends in geopolitics, which feels very on-brand for this guy. The surveillance stuff is where it gets wild because he did not mean vibes. He meant a real surveillance detection route over hours with data points. Not like he looked out a window and got a bad feeling. Right, not spy intuition from a movie poster. That part actually changes how you hear the whole story, because it's method first. And then the disguise thing was hilarious in a dark way. Calling them costumes instead of disguises is such an intelligence world flex. It is, but the real point is, they're not trying to become another person. They're just trying to stop looking like themselves long enough to move safely. That 3-level breakdown was actually the most useful part to me. Light disguise, long-term disguise, prosthetics, and each one has a different risk profile. Which is funny because the movies make it look like everybody has a drawer full of fake faces. In reality, heat melts your fake mustache like a cheap candle. And suddenly Tom Cruise is doing a lot less work than the CIA officer in Manila. But the deeper thing there is control, right? Control over appearance, control over exposure, control over what a cop sees first. That's the whole game, not theatrical genius. Then he turns around and says anxiety is useful, which is such a reversal. Basically, the CIA looked at anxious people and said, finally, someone paying attention. That is an absolutely brutal recruitment strategy. But it makes sense if your job is noticing what other people miss. Anxiety is just overactive pattern detection with bad PR. That's a much kinder way to put it than you're broken but observant. What I liked is that he didn't romanticize fear reduction. He basically said you don't kill fear, you train around it. And stress inoculation is such a good phrase for that. It sounds medical, but it's really just controlled suffering. Controlled suffering is the entire human brand, honestly. What's interesting is how he applies that to ordinary life. Don't wait to become fearless. Just expose yourself to smaller fears. That's actually better advice than believe in yourself, which is basically decorative. Decorative is crazy, but true. Ask the awkward question. Make the small pitch. Go to the gym. Get rejected a little. Because the body learns faster than the ego does. And the ego is the slowest intern in the room. He also had that very cold line about people who are too scared. He basically said, if you can't act, stay where you are because the system needs that too. That was one of the sharpest and bleakest things he said. He's not giving charity there, he's describing an ecosystem. Very gracious ecosystem, by the way. Yeah, the economy thanks you for your fear. Then there's the identity piece, which is where this stopped being spy talk and got personal. He said you are often the worst judge of who you are. That one hits because everyone thinks their self-image is objective. But you're staring at yourself from inches away with a magnifying glass. Everyone else is across the street seeing the full picture. So basically, your worst critic is also your least informed critic. That's such an irritatingly accurate way to say it. And that ties back to action, because identity becomes this fake permission slip. People wait until they feel like a founder, a speaker, a writer, whatever. But action comes first, and the identity catches up later. Which is annoying, because it means there's no ceremonial moment where you get crowned as yourself. No, you just start doing the thing and hope nobody notices you're improvising. The geopolitical stuff was the other huge turn, though. He basically said the US is in a messy adolescence, which is a savage metaphor. Also depressingly believable. And his China take was not one side wins and that's it. It was parity, then instability, then a world with competing superpowers. That's the part people underestimate, because parity sounds calm. But parity is actually when both sides become most dangerous. Two giants staring at each other is not a peaceful room, especially when both giants think they're the reasonable one. And he's basically saying World War III is already here, just not in the old costume. Proxy wars, funding smaller countries as battlefields, that whole framework, that's a heavy way to end the arc, honestly. But it connects to the whole philosophy of the episode. Information is power, and people are always pretending it's something cleaner than that. He never really lets you forget that knowledge can be ethical or predatory. He's basically saying, yes, human psychology is a weapon, now behave. Which is maybe the most honest warning possible. I think the ending lands because he doesn't offer a fairy tale. He offers leverage, awareness, and a pretty unsentimental view of reality. Not comforting, but extremely clarifying. And that's probably why the series works as a whole. It starts with tradecraft, then slowly reveals that everyone is doing tradecraft. Sales, politics, dating, family, all of it is stealth with better branding. Some people just get nicer LinkedIn titles for it. But if there's a real takeaway, it's that fear shrinks when you move, and identity gets healthier when you stop worshiping it. That feels like the actual finale here, not the spy stuff. Yeah, the spy stuff was the doorway, and the human stuff was the room. That was annoyingly poetic, but I'll allow it. We'll wrap it there, and honestly, this 4-part stretch was a monster. If people came for secrets, they probably left with a mirror instead. Which is always the more uncomfortable product. Thanks for being here for the whole run, and we'll see you next time. Welcome back. This one's about tradecraft, fear, and what knowing too much does to a person. And honestly, the weirdest part is how practical it all sounds. That is the part that gets you because it stops being movie stuff fast. The surveillance piece alone was wild because he didn't guess it, he ran a process. Right, that surveillance detection route thing is basically patience weaponized. 3 hours of paranoia with a checklist is suddenly a professional skill. It's hilarious and terrifying that the spy version of intuition is just disciplined repetition. And that makes the whole fear conversation hit harder because anxiety becomes an asset. That part is almost offensive if you have a normal brain and a normal therapist. Imagine telling somebody, your panic is actually your competitive edge. But he's not glorifying it, he's saying anxiety makes you watchful. That distinction matters because he's not romanticizing suffering. He's saying the raw material can be useful if it gets trained properly. The stress inoculation idea was probably the cleanest takeaway in the whole episode. It's just exposure, but with military-level intention. And the reason people stay stuck is usually because they keep waiting to feel ready, which is a scam the brain sells you for free. The brain really is a terrible life coach sometimes. His point was brutal, though. You don't beat fear by arguing with it. You beat it by shrinking the task until your body stops treating it like death. That's actually a very kind way to think about courage. Kind, but still annoying, because it means there's no dramatic shortcut. The average person wants a breakthrough, but he's basically arguing for boring reps. Which is the least sexy answer possible, and probably why it works. Exactly, every real answer is embarrassing in public. The thing I kept thinking about was how much of this was about control. Control over your body, control over your reaction, control over your story. That's what the disguises were too, in a way. Yeah, and the costume language was revealing because it strips away the fantasy. No, not James Bond, just a weird person with fake eyebrows. Which is somehow more believable and less glamorous at the same time. And the level 3 prosthetic stuff showed how fragile that world really is. Heat, sweat, adhesive failing, all of it is just operational reality. Movies make it look like spies can become anyone, but real life is way messier. Real life is basically, can your fake beard survive the weather? The sex espionage section was probably the most ethically loaded part of the whole thing. Because once intimacy enters the room, control stops being clean. It stops being an assignment and starts becoming a human mess. And he was very blunt that some services weaponize that much more freely. which tells you a lot about systems that don't care about individual boundaries. The most interesting part was how often he came back to leverage. Even fear becomes leverage if you can read it before the other person does. That is a deeply creepy sentence, by the way. But it's also the whole business model of intelligence and probably half of business. That's why the geopolitics segment didn't feel random to me. He's using the same logic at the level of countries instead of people. The parity argument is scary because it makes stability sound temporary. Right, once two powers are close enough, everything becomes more unstable, not less. It's almost like the danger isn't domination, it's the transition out of domination. That is a nightmare for investors, governments, and people who like calm. And his World War III take was basically that the war is already here, just distributed. Proxy wars, funding, leverage, alliances, all of it hidden inside local conflicts. Which is a cheerful thought before lunch. Yeah, nothing like a global systems breakdown to improve your afternoon. But the episode wasn't really trying to make you scared of the world. It was trying to make you less scared of your own life. That's the part people probably miss if they only hear the spy packaging. His closing advice was basically action over identity, again and again. And not perfect action, just first action, even if it's ugly. Ugly action is still action, which is rude but true. The identity point hit because we all edit ourselves too harshly from the inside. He made the self-view sound like a bad zoom lens. You're zoomed in on every flaw while everyone else is just walking past. That's such a humiliatingly accurate description of being a person. And then the final answer about equality was the sharpest disagreement point in the whole arc. He basically said people don't actually want equality, they want advantage. Which is cynical, but not obviously false. That's the uncomfortable thing. It lands because it sounds like someone who's seen the machinery. I don't know if I buy all of it, but I get why he believes it. Yeah, because once you spend your life around secrets, innocence starts looking naive. And maybe that's the cost of the whole profession, not just the skill set. You don't just learn how people work, you also learn how ugly the incentives are. Which is why the family decision at the end mattered so much. Leaving the CIA together wasn't just a career pivot, it was a life correction. That part humanized everything else instantly. Because underneath the tradecraft, he was still choosing his kid. And honestly, that's the least spy thing and the best thing in the whole conversation. If this 4-part run had a thesis, it's probably that power starts internally. The people who can govern themselves can probably govern anything else better. Unless they're lying to themselves, which is most people before coffee. Okay, fair, no one should run a country before coffee. But that's the end of it for this series, and I think it landed exactly where it needed to. We came in expecting espionage tricks and ended up in a conversation about fear, identity, and leverage. That's a pretty great way to spend 4 episodes. We'll leave it there, and we'll see you on the next one.